This happened in the winter of 2021, right around the time when everyone was starting to travel again. I'd been working remotely for nearly 2 years and was feeling completely burnt out. So I decided to book a solo trip to a small, isolated cabin in the mountains of North Georgia. I'm a writer by trade, and I figured a week of total silence and no internet would be exactly what I needed to finish my latest project. I found the place on a smaller niche vacation rental site. It was advertised as a restored pioneer cabin located on 40 acres of private timberland. The photos showed a beautiful rustic interior with a massive stone fireplace and a lofted bedroom. The reviews were sparse but positive, mostly mentioning how quiet and disconnected the place was. The host, a man named Silas, was very quick to respond to my messages. He told me that he lived in a separate house about a mile down the road and that he'd leave the key in a lockbox on the porch. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The drive up was gorgeous, but the final 3 miles were on a narrow, unpaved logging road that wound steeply through dense thickets of hemlock and pine. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to drop behind the ridges. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, though it felt much smaller in person. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering trees that seemed to lean in over the roof. After I unpacked my groceries and set up my laptop, I went out onto the small back porch to get some air. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no wind, just the heavy, cold stillness of the mountains. About 50 yards into the woods, I noticed a small, dilapidated shed. It was tilted at an angle and covered in gray, rotting wood. I didn't think much of it at the time. Old properties like this usually have a few outbuildings. That first night was uneventful, but I had a hard time sleeping. The cabin was old, and every time the temperature dropped, the wood would groan and pop. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that didn't fit the house's natural rhythm. It was a dull, rhythmic thudding coming from somewhere outside. It sounded like someone was hitting a heavy rug against a tree. It happened 4 or 5 times, then stopped. I stayed awake for an hour listening, but it didn't return. The next morning, I went for a walk to clear my head. I decided to check out the old shed I'd seen the day before. As I approached it, I realized that the door wasn't just closed, it was padlocked from the outside with a heavy rusted chain. There were fresh footprints in the light dusting of frost leading from the shed back toward the thickest part of the woods, away from the cabin. They weren't my tracks. I followed them for a few yards, but they vanished into a patch of dense laurel. Feeling a bit uneasy, I headed back to the cabin. When I got inside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I had left my laptop open on the kitchen table, but now it was shut. I was certain I hadn't touched it. I opened it up and my heart nearly stopped. The cursor was sitting in the middle of a blank document I had been working on. Someone had typed a single sentence at the very bottom of the page. The light in the loft is too bright at night. My first instinct was to grab my keys and leave, but then I started to rationalize. I thought maybe Silas had come by to check the propane or the water and had seen the laptop. It was intrusive, sure, but maybe he was just an eccentric, over-involved host. I sent him a message through the rental app asking if he'd been by. He replied 10 minutes later, saying he'd been in town all morning and hadn't been near the property. I spent the rest of the day with the doors locked and my pocket knife on the table. I told myself that if anything else happened, I was gone. Around 7 p.m., a heavy fog rolled in, swallowing the trees and reducing visibility to almost zero. I stayed in the living room, reading by the fire, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The cabin had no curtains, just large paned windows that looked out into the blackness. It felt like being in a fishbowl. I eventually went up to the loft to try and sleep. About an hour into drifting off, I heard a sound that was unmistakable. It was the sound of the front door's floorboards creaking, then the sound of the deadbolt being slowly, quietly turned. I didn't move. I lay perfectly still in the loft, peering over the edge of the railing into the darkened living room below. In the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace, I saw the front door swing open. a figure stepped inside. It wasn't Silas. It was a much younger man, thin and dressed in a dark, oversized coat. He didn't look around. He didn't head for my laptop or my bag. Instead, he walked straight to the center of the room and stood there, perfectly still, looking up at the loft. He stayed that way for 5 minutes. I could hear his breathing. It was heavy and wet, like he had a chest cold. Then he did something that still haunts me. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small handheld mirror, and held it up. He began moving it around, catching the dim orange light from the fireplace and reflecting it on the walls, like he was searching for something. Finally, he turned the mirror toward me. For a split second, I saw my own terrified eyes reflected back at me in the glass. He lowered the mirror, whispered, "Better," and walked back out the door, closing it softly behind him. I didn't wait. I didn't even pack my bags. I grabbed my phone and my car keys, climbed down the loft ladder, and bolted for my car. I didn't care about the fog or the narrow road. I drove like a maniac, my high beams cutting through the white wall of mist. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit gas station 20 miles away. I called the police, and they met me at the station. 2 deputies went up to the cabin while I waited. When they came back, they told me the cabin was empty, but they had found the shed I mentioned. They had to bolt cut the chain to get inside. Inside the shed, they didn't find tools or garden supplies. They found a small, narrow cot, several empty food cans, and a stack of notebooks. The notebooks were filled with sketches, hundreds of them. They were all drawings of the cabin interior, drawn from the perspective of someone looking through the windows. Every single sketch featured me sleeping, me typing, me eating. But the most disturbing part was the dates. The sketches started 3 days before I even arrived at the cabin. The man in the dark coat was never found. Silas claimed he had no idea anyone was living in the shed and that he hadn't checked that part of the property in months. The police suspected the man was a local who'd been squatting on the land and using the rental listings to target solo travelers. I never got my security deposit back, and I never finished that book. I don't go to the mountains anymore, and I never book rentals that are advertised as isolated. Sometimes, when I'm in a room with no curtains, I find myself looking at the glass, wondering if someone out there is holding up a mirror, waiting for the light to be just right.